This month at Manor Park Classics we have the daddest of dad wagons, and something we don't see an awful lot of anymore. A big Ford, coming to us in the form of a Mk3 Ford Granada. Now of course this car was known on the continent as the Ford Scorpio, the first generation Ford Scorpio, but us British, we like our traditions, and so Granada it remained. Now this car isn't the top spec Granada Scorpio as it was known in the UK, but it is a Granada gear 4x4. And just imagine for me something for a second. It's 1989-1990. You are 9, maybe 10 years old, and you can go into school in the morning and tell all your mates that your dad's just come home in a new aero-shaped Granada. And it's not some piffling low-spec Granada either. It's a gear with four-wheel drive. And in this kind of time period, four-wheel drive was still absolutely something to shout at, so much so that the badging on the back looks slightly ridiculous with 3 different typefaces. But regardless, that's cool, because more badges equals more cool. And so when this car was launched in 1985, it was a very important car for Ford, one that I feel a lot of people disregard or forget about in the wider history of Ford. And of course, it was the second to last generation of big Ford executive saloon. Though of course in this case, it's not a saloon, it's a hatchback. Borrowing that aero silhouette and 2-box hatchback kind of notchback shape of the earlier and smaller Ford Sierra. So I want to take you back now to 1976. That was the year that Ford rose up to #1, to Britain's most successful, most popular car manufacturer. In 1976, Ford sold more cars in Britain than anyone else. And in order to cement that position leading up to 1976 to achieve that goal, they didn't have to do all that much. Instead, they were really benefiting from the downfall of British Leyland. They were really filling the void and trading upon what they'd done for the last 15 years or so, since the early 1960s or the very end of the 1950s, in building quite conservatively engineered cars that were quite hardy, that were well understood by everyone, and that were popular with buyers. Fords had grown from being quite frumpy cars in the 1950s to suddenly being very fashion conscious. And so you could buy the likes of a 105e Ford Anglia or a Mark I Cortina, or later of course a Mark I Ford Escort. These cars were not anything special under the skin. They still had leaf springs and live axles, for example, but they absolutely tuned into the wavelength of what the British buyer wanted. And through British Leyland's collapse in the early 1970s, they then achieved that #1 spot, as I said, in 1976. But maintaining that spot was going to be much more challenging for Ford over the coming decades. And of course, they successfully did that for many, many, many decades, but I would wager that they had a harder time retaining it. Because by the late 1970s, Ford's passenger cars had gone from being very fashion conscious, as I just mentioned, to being very derivative, to being very boxy, very square, and not really all that much to write home about. So the old, very, very cool, very stylish Cortinas, even the Coke bottle style Cortina, the Mark III of the early 70s, was replaced by the Mark IV Cortina, and the facelift Mark V Cortina then after through to 1982. And those cars were very boxy. Now that's not to say they were bad looking cars, but they weren't necessarily, they didn't capture attention in the same way that the older Fords did. And similarly, the Ford Granada, when that launched in 1972, was a very good looking car, replacing the old Ford Zephyr. But when the Mark II Granada came along in 1977, it too embraced the very simple, boxy silhouette of its smaller brothers and sisters. You could even say that the Mark II Escort kind of had this same view of the world, though of course it had the halo effect of the Mexicos and RS2000s, etc. Ford finally bucked this trend in 1980, going front-wheel drive of course with the Mark III Escort. And undoubtedly that was the centerpiece of that car's engineering package. But I would say that as far as consumers were concerned, they were more interested in the shape. because the Escort had finally gone hatchback. The Escort suddenly looked all new and had quite an aerodynamic style shape to it, very much unlike the Mark II Escort that preceded it, looking very much like a car of a different era by 1980. In 1982, however, they went radical with that aerodynamic shape, launching the Sierra, which replaced the Mark V Cortina. The Sierra was unapologetic in its new aerodynamic styling, and indeed, only a few months ago, you and I drove one on this YouTube channel. So if you'd like to scroll down a little bit, then I'm sure you'll find that video on quite an early XR4i. But the Sierra was radical, as I mentioned, and that meant that from that very conservative, backdrop of early 1980s Britain, of that large family car market, to see a Sierra go past at the end of 1982 must have been an event. It must have been genuinely remarkable, and while a lot of people were a little bit alienated by its style, it came good in the end. The Sierra was phenomenally popular, and it proved Ford right, that in order to rescue their image and maintain their market position, they had to go a little bit radical. They had to do it because Vauxhall were on the rise, giving us the likes of the Mark I Astra in 1979, predating the front-wheel drive Mark III Escort, and of course bringing us the Mark II Cavalier in 1981, complete with a hatchback shape. Now, the Mark II Cavalier looked much more conservative than the Ford Sierra, and arguably that's why it managed to so easily match and even on a couple of occasions eclipse the Blue Oval. But taken generally, the Sierra had a much longer shelf life thanks to its kind of course, aero shape, but very kind of space-age shape as well. And so 3 years later, in 1985, they applied that same shape to the larger Granada. So before discussing the style in general, I want to bring your attention to two separate touches that I think, well, actually we will go general a little bit first. I think this is a really handsome car. I'm of the view that the Sierra is a little bit ugly, but this, in its own way, though quite conservative appearing to us today, I think is quite a handsome car. But it's brought to life a little bit by the triple-tiered rear lamps that stop it from looking too derivative, but also the floating glass house. Now, this is a trick used by many manufacturers, and I think the two most obvious ones, at least for us in the late 80s and going on towards more modern things, is the R8 Rover 200, launched in 1989, which used that floating glasshouse effect, that floating roof effect, by blacking out all the pillars in order to make the car look much more sleek, to make it look less conservative than it was. And I think that's why it's used here as well, to make the body line appear lower, to make it look like a sleeker, longer car rather than being quite slabby as it may have been in danger of being if it didn't have this effect. I think the most famous use of the floating glasshouse, however, is the first generation modern Mini. The R50 launched in 2001, though that car of course used its floating glasshouse in order to make the roof look like a lid, a la the original Mini with all its exposed seams. But anyway, it allows it to look much lower, it allows it to look much sleeker than it may otherwise do, and I think it's a big part of why I prefer this car visually to the smaller Sierra. But you could easily look at this car in two separate ways. Because first of all, you could look at it as being Ford 1985 in this market segment quite radical. Again, it took on the silhouette of the Sierra that was so controversial in 1982 and applied it to this more conservative market and did it very successfully. But on the other hand, you could view this as the start of the end for Ford in the executive car segment. Because within a few years, this car did not look like anything special. The shock and awe factor of the Sierra in 82 was acceptable by 85, 86, and certainly by 1987, and so this car just looked normal. By waiting 5 years from the Mark III Escort to the Mark III Granada, it appears as though Ford had just stepped off the ball a little bit. They'd waited that little bit too long, and so when the Mark III Granada came along, it wasn't all that much of a news story. And of course, there's a reason Ford no longer inhabit this market segment, And that's because the German premium manufacturers began to take over, the likes of BMW and Mercedes-Benz, for example, who had a very defined, very slick image and very slick corporate style. Ford, on the other hand, didn't have that, and I've in the past described Ford of the 70s and 80s as automotive blancmange. And that's not being said in a derogatory way. I think it's true for most mainstream manufacturers of the period, but nobody knew what a Ford looked like. Every Ford looked different to one another, and every generation they totally revised their style yet again. A BMW or a Mercedes-Benz, for example, always looked like a BMW or a Mercedes-Benz. And therefore they built up that brand recognition. And through being a premium marque, they appeared posher to the average consumer of an executive car in the United Kingdom. So as the 1980s progressed into the 1990s, people started to look away from the big Fords and the big Vauxhalls, the Carlton, for example, and even away from the big Rovers as well. The Rover 800 would have competed with this, towards those traditional German premium marques. So I think that's a bit of a shame that this car, you know, you can look at it from two very different perspectives. You can look at it as the final chapter of Ford going aero, going radical in the mid-80s and trying to cling on to that #1 spot in the British market, but you could also see the very top of Ford starting to be eaten away by those premium manufacturers. So with that waffle out of the way, let's have a look at the interior before we go for a drive. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to my Ford Granada. And if we were going to discuss the German premium marques, BMW, Mercedes-Benz, Audi, even into the 1990s as well, then I would like to discuss something that I think went missing from this segment of cars. So of course we've mentioned that Ford haven't existed in this segment for 25 years nearly now. But of course, another thing we've lost is the comfort factor. Because in chasing sales, in chasing a very desirable appearance, in chasing what they think customers want, manufacturers have gone towards sportier appearances. They've gone towards rock-hard suspension, huge alloy wheels and leather seats that are cold in the winter and hot in the summer. Now, I understand the virtues of all of those things, and indeed, behind the camera is my E46 BMW, but, viewer, it's an SE. It does not have huge alloy wheels and it does not have rock-hard suspension. But sitting in this car, I can't help but feel that we've lost something. In front of me, we have a very, very thin rimmed steering wheel, which naturally makes the car feel delicate, in spite of the fact that, of course, it has power steering and it's a big old beast of a car as well, but that makes it feel more delicate. It makes you want to drive it in a more conservative, more reserved manner. We do have a manual gearbox, which I don't feel suits this car, you know, enormously, but it's there nonetheless. It's the late 80s, what can you say? But we have this very swooshy dashboard, very organic dashboard with the controls right where you need them. The heater controls being right there is just perfect. Why more cars don't have the controls you need right there with physical buttons as well, I just don't know. But we have a little slab of what I assume is fake wood across the dashboard, but I think it looks good. I think it looks, as I said, very organic and executive. It might not be the highest rate material in the world, but I think it feels very classy. It feels very suitable for a car like this because, let's be honest, it was primarily the older folk who were buying a Granada. But that brings us then to the comfort of the seats, because we have this just incredible velour upholstery and very, very supportive seats. They support you just like you'd expect a more modern seat to, maybe not quite with as much bolstering, but still you feel very supported by these seats. But they're so soft and they're so squishy. And on a day like today, where it's about 4.5 degrees outside, it's not cold. There are a few irregularities in here though, because it's the late 80s into the early 90s and manufacturers still weren't quite sure on how to position all the electronic goodies. There are a few blanking switches here and there, but the front electric window controls are on the driver's door, as you'd expect. Now, to be fair, a lot of cars still weren't doing this, so props to Ford for that at least. But the rear window switches are in the centre by the handbrake, flanked by a load of blanking plates just to let you know that although you're driving a Granada Gear 4x4, you're not as posh as you think you are. There is also a button down here that I assume might be for the heated door mirrors, but I can't be quite sure on that. What I can say that if an old person is driving a Granada, as I said, they usually probably were older folk because the younger ones were going for something a little bit more sporty, let's say. The radio controls are tiny. How an old bloke, for example, could fiddle these controls, I just don't quite know. But anyway, if I look back and realise this car is a lot longer than I always think it is, let's go for a drive. So, under the bonnet of our dad wagon and allowing it to feel ever so creamy smooth is the good old Cologne V6. All 2.8 litres worth of it that was seen under the bonnet of so many Fords, from a Capri 2.8 injection to the Sierra XR4i we drove a few months ago to, of course, these and the last generation Scorpio. The Scorpio when it became known as the Scorpio in the UK, and the end of production of these cars as well when it was brought to 2.9 litres and tuned by Cosworth with multi-valve cylinder heads and 200 odd horsepower. This, of course, is not one of those. This is the old 2.8 litre Cologne V6 with single overhead camshafts. Then it doesn't have overhead camshafts. It has a single camshaft, 2 valves per cylinder, push rods, and about 160 horsepower, there or thereabouts, which is perfectly adequate for a car like this to do what I'm doing now, which is just poodling about the place. Because if we're going to take executive cars like this, what do they spend most of the time doing? They are doing a commute, sat in traffic in a city centre somewhere, or they are doing long motorway journeys, or they're doing big cross-continental holidays with all the family in it. And in that use case, the way that these cars are actually used, something like this, with the comfort of this, with the refinement, the smoothness of that Cologne V6, you can barely hear it. You just can't hear it. I've got my foot flat down to the floor at 3,000 RPM and it's barely audible. It really is. And of course, we have the practicality edition of the hatchback, which is just fantastic. I don't see what any more, a more premium executive car, what one of those brings over this. Because I don't think it does bring very much over this. Because this just has all the smoothness. It has the visibility as well that you'd want. And as I said before, that thin rim steering wheel, big 2-spoke wheel though it is, just makes you drive the car quite delicately. So I'm thoroughly enjoying just pootling around the place in this car. In fact, under the body, this car is very much like a Sierra as well. Indeed, it has similar suspension to the Sierra, so it does have an independent rear end, semi-trailing arms to be exact, which just have some Cologne V6 noises for your pleasure, a little bit of wind noise from that sunroof, which of course I've got open because if you didn't, it would be a travesty. But as I was saying, yes, if you're going to take the independent rear suspension of this car with its semi-trailing arms and relate it to something we've been talking about quite a lot, it's a similar kind of rear suspension to that used by BMWs of, up to the early 1990s. And so it's a thoroughly pleasant, thoroughly refined family car to just use and poodle along in and to enjoy and to look quite cool in the modern world as well. In spite of the fact that I think that in period this car was just about in danger of looking like nothing special. Nowadays, of course, it looks totally different to that. So if you were to buy a car like this today from us here at Manor Park Classics, I think the best thing to do with it is to do a little bit of work on it, get it, absolutely perfect visually and the way it runs. It's very close, but just a little bit extra just to get it to that point and then use it every day. That's what I'd do with it anyway, because I feel it's so capable of doing a daily commute. It's so capable of sitting on a motorway at high speed. Don't forget, of course, that this is a pan-European car, primarily designed in Germany, not in the UK, and so this car was very much designed to be used on the German autobahns, doing way over 100 miles per hour as a cruising speed, and so they are very, very capable long distance cars. And if we're talking about overseas markets as well, we can't not mention the United States, because while the US had their own range of Fords throughout this era, they imported a couple of European Fords, badged them as Mk3s, German for Mercury, again, Ford Group things, and they sold the Sierra and the Granada, or Scorpio. And they didn't do quite as well as Ford might have wanted them to, but they weren't exactly what US buyers wanted at that period of time. And so that's understandable, but they were always perfectly good, perfectly usable cars. But to take us one step beyond the norm and something we don't see very much of anymore, and into something that was brand new in 1985-86, and that's anti-lock brakes. Every single Mark III Granada was fitted as standard with ABS, which means it's the first production car ever to come with anti-lock brakes as standard fitment across the range. And that is absolutely something to write home about. So I've thoroughly enjoyed my few minutes pootling about around this little business park in this Granada gear 4x4, and I think in period, if you were to come around somewhere like here, there'd be a few of these knocking about the place. But today, of course, there are none. There are a lot of SUVs though, which is not quite my thing. But if you'd like a throwback to when Ford made big family saloons, then please do follow the link in the description. Head over to our website, should I say. Have a look at the images of this car, have a look at the description, and maybe even come along and look at it for yourself. Once more before we end, it's got some punch to it, that Cologne V6.